My name is Sinclair Davidson. I'm a Professor of Institutional Economics at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I've done quite a bit of work on the plain packaging policy that was introduced in 2012. When you look carefully at what has happened, you will actually find that the policy has failed quite spectacularly. The policy objectives of the plain packaging policy are set out in the legislation. It's to encourage people to give up smoking, to discourage people from taking up smoking, and to prevent people who have relapsed from taking up smoking again. What has happened is, if you have a look at the National Drug Survey, there's a massive decline in the prevalence of smoking from the 1990s when it first started all the way to 2013, and you can see all the policies that were introduced at the time. Then fast forward to 2016, and all of a sudden you see for the first time in 20-30 years that there isn't really a decline. That difference that you can see there is not a statistically significant difference from the 3 years previous. Now, it's important to understand that in the 3 years there's been a massive increase in population. If the prevalence of smoking hasn't fallen, in actual fact there are more people smoking in Australia today than what there were 5 years ago when the policy was introduced. If at first, if you don't succeed, then you should either change the rules or cheat. And the government has changed the rules and cheated. There is the 3.4% lie. During a debate as to whether or not smoking prevalence had declined as a result of the policy, a story suddenly appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald at one of the government's go-to journalists, who reported, rather breathlessly, that Treasury had released secret information showing that taxation paid on tobacco had declined by 3.4% in the first year after the introduction of the policy. This was secret information that nobody could access, but Senator David Leyonhjelm of New South Wales started asking questions in the Parliament, and the Freedom of Information requests started flowing. Eventually, Treasury was forced to release the data. And when you analyze the data and you correct for timing issues, the policy was introduced in December and not January, and you correct for the information around tax refunds that occurred, is that a 3.4% decline becomes a 0.8% decline when you adjust for the calendar effects, and when you adjust for the tax refunds, it becomes a 0.5% increase. To their credit, the Australian government commissioned a tracking study to determine what happened after the introduction of plain packaging tobacco. My colleague Ashton De Silva and I have done a very careful and rigorous analysis of the government survey results. And what we find is that there's great evidence of data mining, of using different data across the studies, using different time periods, different variables. They don't actually test quitting behavior before and after the policy was introduced, and when you control for all their inconsistent methodological choices, you actually find that the results are simply not robust at all. In the post-implementation study, the government reproduced this particular graph. And if you have a look at this graph, it's very fascinating. You see a downward trend in tobacco prevalence in Australia, and at the introduction of the policy, you see what clearly appears to be a trend break and a decline here in terms of smoking prevalence. People have referred to this particular graph as definitive evidence that in actual fact the policy had worked. But in actual fact, what you find is that the researcher simply chopped the data off at this point and fitted a trend line, and chopped the data at this point and fitted the trend line. If you have a look at the entire data series without that chop in the data, this is what it looks like. And as you can see, there is no evidence of any break around December 2012. The government was able to show that 0.55% of the decline in smoking that would have occurred anyway could have been due to plain packaging. What the government didn't tell us is that the sample error for their data is 0.6%. So in actual fact, the the effect that they found was smaller than the random variation in the data that you would expect anyway. And people who understand statistics know that that means what they found was zero. No change in the prevalence of smoking after cooking the analysis, after beating it up. The data refused to confess. There is no evidence that the government's policy on their second attempt to prove that it worked actually had worked.